The early 20th century was a time of great uncertainty and tension in Europe. The continent was a cauldron of competing interests and simmering rivalries. The major powers were engaged in a fierce competition for resources, colonies, and global dominance. This scramble for power extended far beyond Europe, reaching into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This competition fostered an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility. Diplomatic relations were strained, and alliances were formed and broken with alarming frequency. The great powers of Europe were like wary gladiators circling each other in the arena. Each nation was preparing for the possibility of conflict, investing heavily in their military capabilities. They eyed each other with suspicion, their hands hovering near their weapons. The slightest misstep could lead to a catastrophic confrontation. Nationalism, a potent force, was sweeping through Europe. It was a double-edged sword, inspiring both unity and division. It fueled a desire for unity and independence among different ethnic groups. These aspirations often clashed with the interests of the established powers. However, it also bred rivalry and animosity between nations. Propaganda and rhetoric stoked the fires of hatred and mistrust. Each nation believed in its own superiority, its own destiny to rule. This sense of exceptionalism made compromise difficult. This made diplomacy difficult and war almost inevitable. The diplomatic channels were clogged with mistrust and deceit. Militarism was another dangerous force at play. The belief in the power and necessity of a strong military was pervasive. The great powers were engaged in a massive arms race, building up their armies and navies at an alarming rate. This build-up only heightened the sense of impending conflict. Military leaders gained increasing influence in government affairs, and the possibility of war was openly discussed and even welcomed in some circles. War was seen as a means to resolve disputes and assert dominance. Military parades became common spectacles, their displays of martial might thinly veiled threats. These parades were not just for show, they were a demonstration of readiness and resolve. The world was sitting on a powder keg, and all it would take was a single spark to ignite the conflagration. The tension was palpable and the stakes were incredibly high. That spark came in the summer of 1914 in a city called Sarajevo. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain reaction that would engulf the world in war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie on June 28, 1914, proved to be that spark. The assassination was carried out by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist associated with the Black Hand, a secret society that advocated for a unified Serbian nation. Austria-Hungary, a sprawling empire already facing internal tensions, viewed the assassination as a direct attack on its sovereignty. The assassination of the Archduke and his wife sent shockwaves through Europe. Austria-Hungary, with the backing of its powerful ally Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding satisfaction and a harsh crackdown on anti-Austrian sentiment. Serbia, backed by Russia, attempted to negotiate but was ultimately unwilling to accept all of Austria-Hungary's demands. The intricate system of alliances that had been built up over the previous decades began to kick in, dragging one nation after another into the conflict. Europe in 1914 was a web of alliances, a network of treaties and agreements that obligated nations to come to each other's aid in the event of war. These alliances, intended to deter aggression, instead served to amplify the crisis. Germany, Austria, Hungary's staunch ally, pledged its unwavering support. Russia, bound by treaty to Serbia, began mobilizing its vast army. France, allied with Russia, and Britain, wary of Germany's growing power, were drawn into the conflict. Within a month of the assassination in Sarajevo, Europe was at war. Germany, declaring war on Russia, and then France implemented the Schlieffen Plan, a military strategy that called for a rapid advance through Belgium to knock France out of the war before Russia could fully mobilize its forces. Belgium, a neutral country, resisted the German advance, giving Britain the pretext it needed to declare war on Germany. The Schlieffen Plan, while initially successful, ultimately failed to achieve its objective of a swift victory against France. The plan's failure marked the beginning of a prolonged and grueling conflict. The German advance was halted at the Battle of the Marne, and the war on the Western Front settled into a bloody stalemate. This battle was a turning point, preventing the Germans from capturing Paris. Both sides dug in, creating an intricate system of trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles across northeastern France and Belgium. These trenches became the defining feature of the Western Front. The Western Front became synonymous with trench warfare, a brutal and attritional form of combat. Soldiers faced constant danger and the ever-present threat of death. Soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable conditions, living in mud-filled trenches constantly under the threat of artillery bombardment, machine gun fire, and poison gas attacks. The psychological toll was immense. Attacks, often launched across open ground, resulted in horrific casualties with little gain. The term "no man's land" became synonymous with death and destruction. The Battle of the Somme, launched by the British and French in July 1916, epitomized the horrors of the Western Front. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Intended to break the stalemate and achieve a decisive breakthrough, the Somme offensive became a symbol of the war's futility. The initial bombardment was heard across the English Channel. After months of fighting, the Allies had gained only a few miles of ground at a staggering cost in human life. The landscape was left scarred and desolate. The Battle of Verdun, fought between the Germans and French earlier in 1916, was another example of the devastating nature of a trench warfare. Verdun became a symbol of French determination and suffering. Section 5. Beyond the trenches, war on multiple fronts. While the Western Front was the primary theatre of war, the conflict raged on multiple fronts. In the east, Russia, despite its massive army, suffered heavy losses against the Germans. The Eastern Front was characterized by greater mobility than the static Western Front, but it was no less brutal. The vast distances and harsh conditions added to the misery of the soldiers. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined the war in 1914, opening up new fronts in the Middle East. British and French forces clashed with Ottoman troops in the Gallipoli campaign, a disastrous attempt to capture the Dardanelles Strait and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. In the Middle East, the war had a profound impact, leading to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the redrawing of the map of the region. Section 6. Technological innovations and their impact. World War I witnessed the introduction of new technologies and weapons that had a profound impact on the nature of warfare. Machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute made offensive operations extremely costly. Artillery, more accurate and powerful than ever before, could inflict massive casualties from afar. Poison gas, first used by the Germans in 1915, added a new dimension of horror to the battlefield. The development of tanks and airplanes revolutionized warfare. Tanks, initially cumbersome and unreliable, offered the potential to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Airplanes, initially used for reconnaissance, soon evolved into weapons of war, used for bombing and dogfighting. The war spurred rapid technological advancements in these areas. Section 7. The unfathomable cost of war. World War I was a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. Millions of soldiers and civilians perished in the fighting or died from disease and starvation. The war left an indelible scar on an entire generation. The psychological impact of the war, with its shell shock and the trauma experienced by soldiers, added to the human cost. The war had a devastating impact on the home fronts of the warring nations. Women were forced to take on new roles in factories and farms as men went off to fight. Resources were rationed and economies were geared towards the war effort. The war led to social and political upheavals as people questioned the leadership that had led them into such a catastrophe. Section 8. A world transformed, the aftermath. By 1918, after more than 4 years of devastating warfare, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies. The United States, which had entered the war in 1917, provided a much-needed boost to the Allied war effort. Germany, facing exhaustion and internal unrest, was finally forced to seek an armistice. The war officially ended on November 11, 1918, with the signing of the armistice. The The world was left to grapple with the war's devastating consequences. Millions lay dead, empires had crumbled, and Europe was in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war, but it also sowed the seeds for future conflicts. Section 9. A legacy of conflict and change. The Treaty of Versailles, while intended to prevent another global conflict, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, reshaping the political landscape of Europe. Germany was forced to accept blame for the war, cede territory, disarm, and pay massive reparations, which crippled its economy. These punitive measures created resentment and instability in Germany, contributing to the rise of extremism and the outbreak of World War II just 2 decades later. World War I had a profound impact on the 20th century, altering the course of history in numerous ways. It led to the collapse of empires, the redrawing of national boundaries, and the creation of new nations, and the rise of new ideologies. It accelerated technological advancements, transformed social and economic structures, and changed the role of women in society, and left an indelible mark on the human psyche, with the trauma of war echoing through generations. The Great War, as it came to be known, was a tragedy that shaped the course of history, a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of diplomacy and understanding in a world forever changed by war.